Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. I'm Bill Lacey, the director here. Some of you may be aware that I've been on a leave of absence from the university for the last 8 months, and it's great to be back here in Lawrence, and great to be back here at the Dole Institute and to have such an excellent program the very first night that I'm back. I want to thank my team here at the Dole Institute for doing a wonderful job over the last 8 months. They have done just a terrific job, and I hope all of you have had an opportunity to check out some of the programming that they've been conducting during this period of time. I also wanted to let you know about 3 upcoming programs here at the Dole Institute that you can read about on the back of your program tonight. Tomorrow night, I will be sitting on the hot seat being questioned about my recent experiences as campaign manager for Senator Fred Thompson's presidential campaign. That will be quite interesting. I can promise you that that will be an entertaining program. I have the inside information on that program. On Thursday night at 7:30 p.m., we have a program titled First Spouses, Changing Roles and Expectations, which we think will be very enjoyable. And finally, the Dole Lecture, the annual Dole Lecture, will take place next Thursday, April 10th, here at the Dole Institute. That lecture is at 1 p.m. and features Tom Brokaw. And we're very excited to have Mr. Brokaw returning to the Dole Institute for the first time since the dedication of the Institute just about 5 years ago. Let me give you a few guidelines. We will, after our guest finishes her remarks tonight, we will allow time, as we always do here at the Dole Institute, for questions and answers. We do have some requests, though. First of all, if you have a question that you would like to ask, please raise your hand and wait to be recognized so we can get a microphone to you, because we'll be taping tonight's program or digitally recording tonight's program to play back on our website. So please raise your hand, wait for someone to bring you a microphone. Secondly, please ask a single question, one question. That gives more people a chance to ask questions. No speeches, no filibustering. And we have ruled people out of order for filibustering here. And then I would also ask that you all please do turn off your cell phones. I finally want to give a special welcome to Ms. Linda Sue Warner, who's the president of the Haskell Indian Nations University. Ms. Warner, stand up and let everybody recognize you. We're delighted that you could join us tonight, so thanks so much for coming over and being part of our program. Last summer, when I decided to take a leave of absence, encouraged by Senator Dole and encouraged by Chancellor Bob Hemingway to kind of rejoin the political wars for a limited period of time, the Dole Institute was very lucky to get the leadership skills of Professor Jonathan Earl, who's normally our Associate Director for Programming, as the Interim Director of the Dole Institute. John and I have worked very closely together since I came to the Institute in September of '04. He was a natural choice for the job. He has managed the effort seamlessly, done an outstanding job, and really kept the Dole Institute creating and producing programming like tonight, the kind of programming that really has reached out to many people in the community and many of the students here on campus. And so, with no further ado, to introduce our guest tonight, please welcome the immediate past interim director, now associate director for programming of the Dole Institute of Politics, Dr. John Earl. John.
I guess I have something new to put on my business cards. Immediate past interim director. Thank you, Bill. And it is good to be back to my usual job. Winona LaDuke is, finishing this sentence is hard because she is many things. Candidate for office, author, actor, mother, and I found out today, grandmother. Mostly, though, Winona LaDuke is an activist for the environment, women's issues, and Native peoples. She has spent her adult life speaking and writing about these issues, including addressing the United Nations, I found out, at age 18. LaDuke was raised in Ashland, Oregon, home of Southern Oregon University, but after graduating from Harvard in 1982 with a degree in rural economic development, I didn't know you had that major at Harvard, she accepted a job as principal of the high school on the Ojibwe White Earth Reservation in Minnesota. She quickly found herself involved in a lawsuit to recover lands promised to the Ojibwe people by an 1867 federal treaty. When the case was dismissed 4 years later, she founded the White Earth Land Recovery Project to continue efforts to regain lost lands. Unlike so many of the tribes in our nation, the Ojibwe had never been removed from from their tribal homes. They were promised that their lands would always, heretofore and forever, remain theirs if they signed a treaty with the federal government. Well, 80 years later, over 90% of the original 837,000 acres were in the hands of non-Indians. Using grants and a $20,000 human rights prize from Reebok, the sneaker guys, the group has bought several thousand acres back and hopes to acquire at least 30,000 more. In addition to running the White Earth Land Recovery Project, she's the co-chair of the Indigenous Women's Network and the program director of Honor the Earth, where she provides vision and leadership for the organization's re-granting program and its strategic initiatives. In addition, she's worked for 2 decades on the land rights issues of the White Earth Reservation, including continuing that litigation I mentioned. She's the recipient of far too many honors and awards to mention here, including the aforementioned Reebok Human Rights Award, the Thomas Merton Award, the Anne Bancroft Award, the Global Green Award, and the prestigious International Slow Food Award for working to protect wild rice and local biodiversity. She's the author of the novel Last Standing Woman, and the last chapter of that one, I think it's fair to warn you, is in Ojibwe, so careful. The nonfiction book All Our Relations, Native Struggles for Land and Life, and Recovering the Sacred, The Power of Naming and Claiming, a book about traditional beliefs and practices. She appeared in several films and documentaries, including Anthem, The Mainstream, and Skins. And since we're here at the Dole Institute of Politics, I think it's definitely worth mentioning she gained nationwide political attention in 1996 when she ran as the vice presidential candidate for the Green Party on the ticket headed by Ralph Nader, and she did the same exact thing in the year 2000. In September of 2007, just last year, LaDuke was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. To lead a program tonight, I welcome to the stage Ms. Winona LaDuke.
Hi there. Can you all hear me okay then? Anin indo e maganatuk nigagwe kitamagas bine sigwe to go makwa indo dem gawababani kagish kaniganing and rujiba migwich and of manasivan migwich mama kingoma. So as you may have gathered, that was Ojibwe, and I'm thanking you very much for the honor of being here today and telling you where I'm from, which is the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. You all know where Minnesota is? Very good. I'm between Bemidji and Fargo. Good. All right, there we are. And I'm one of 7 Ojibwe reservations in northern Minnesota. There's 19 Ojibwe reservations in the United States, and we're one of the largest there. And I'm telling you my clan, which is that I'm Bear Clan. And thank you again very much for the honor of being here in this beautiful and very windy area. And I was like, oh my gosh. Guys are even more windy than North Dakota, I would say. You might give them a run for their money in that. So as I reflected on talking about these issues of sustainability, climate change, and Indigenous thinking, I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we are thinking on this. And this time right now is Iskigami Zikigizis in Ojibwe, Iskigami Zikigizis, which is the maple syruping moon. Do you have maple trees? Yeah. Did it already run? Passed. Okay, so you had that month. All right, we're in that month now. It has not yet run. A little bit challenging with climate change, but it is. We expect it to run now. And the moon that we just had before this, my personal favorite moon because I like how it sounds, is Anabanagesis. That great Anabanagesis, which means hard-crusted snow moon, which is when it snows and then it thaws, and then it's also the moon that you don't want to do a face plant in the snow. And then we have Wabaganagesis, the flower moon, and Odemanagesis, strawberry moon, Meangesis, the blueberry moon, Manomanikegesis, the wild rice-making moon, the leaf-changing color moon, Goshkadnogesis, then the freezing over moon, little spirit moon, Manadugesis, Soons, Gitchi Manadugesis, and Nemebenagesis. Those are our moons. Why did I tell you that? I told you that because I don't know if you noticed that none of those moons is named after a Roman emperor. It is possible to have an entire worldview that has nothing to do with empire. And that is in part the argument that I'm going to make to you, is that there is some possibility that a worldview that is not based on empire may be more sustainable than a worldview and a way of life that is based on empire. So that is essentially the argument. And in saying that, I'm going to ask you to put aside some of your biases. I've spent a lot of time in educational institutions, went all the way through public and private school in this country, and I know full well the most indigenous people's thinkings is kind of relegated to a shelf someplace that you take an anthropology class and is not considered relevant in political thought and intellectual thought and scientific thought and other paradigms. I'm going to ask you to think about shelving that idea and instead considering that it is possible that other worldviews that are not Eurocentric have something to offer in thinking about where we are in the world and where we are going in the world in itself. And I know this is true because I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and when you wanted to study art, if you wanted to study art from Europe, you went to fine arts. And if you wanted to study art from Native America, you went to anthropology, which says something about the perception of what is fine and what is valid. And so I'm fully aware of an educational bias which is in one direction. And I think that in this day and age, and I think that prior to this it would have been helpful to have a broader sense of depth and appreciation for what is knowledge and what is of value, because we would probably be in far less wars if we had that kind of recognition. So in saying that, I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous thinking and tell you that in our language, in our Anishinaabe-Moan, we have a phrase which is Gitchi Debwewen, which means the great law, the Creator's law. And we say that if you want to build one should create a society which lives in accordance with the Creator's law. That's our teaching. To not do so, we believe, would be folly. What do we know about the Creator's law? We know that we are all related. Nindawe Maganaduk, that's how you say it, Nindawe Maganaduk, which means that we recognize our relatives have fins, have wings, have paws, have roots, have hooves. We are not anthropocentric in the knowledge of who our relatives are. That's what we say. And some people might view that in a different view. But I will tell you that we know where we came from. And we know that, for instance, in our whole creation story, we are saved by the muskrat. There was a great flood that came to our people. A lot of peoples have this great flood story in their oral history. In our case, we had the great flood as well. And in the case of our people in the great flood, our Anishinaabe, it is said that the original woman was on the back of a Micanac, a giant Micanac, which they say existed in this area. I saw some Galapagos tortoises a few weeks ago, but these were the even bigger guys, like leatherbacks, and they said that they were in the Great St. Lawrence Seaway. And that up in that area that this woman was on the pack, and she was trying to make the earth, the Mother Earth, Mama I King, but there was a great tortoise there, and there was no land. And so the various charismatic megafauna volunteered to go down and get some soil for her. And first was the loon, and then there was the otter, the nagig, the mukwa, the bear, but none of them could bring up the earth from the bottom. It was the wajushk, the muskrat, who brought that up, and that is how we got this earth here. That is how they say in our oral history. That is how we got this Turtle Island. And so in that, we recognize that we are entirely, our life is dependent on that muskrat. That muskrat is who gave us the ability to be here, you know. And so that gives us a certain humility and an understanding of where we are in this. And we also know that we are the last ones to arrive. And between you and I think you know that the rest of them could get on fine without us. You know, we're the ones that cause the problems in our anthropocentric worldview. We're the ones that consume too much of the biosphere. And so our relatives cannot be in full health, you know. But they'd be fine without us. We come to a teaching that says that all things which are natural are cyclical. Whether it is the moons, the tides, the seasons, they are all recognized as cyclical. And in our own teachings, we recognize our part in that. Natural systems are cyclical systems, and one would do well to live in accordance with cyclical systems. So that is even in those times that I told you about and I referred to in our moons, those refer to the times that are on the earth, not some times that are in some other culture. They refer to where we are in relationship to the earth in the moons, and when it is time to plant, and when it is, you know, and we reaffirm our relationship to the cyclical, to the worldview through this. We are taught in our teachings that most things are animate. In our language, most nouns are animate. Very interesting. Some are inanimate. But for instance, asin, the word for stone, is an animate noun in Ojibwe. Asin, the word for stone, is animate, meaning has standing, has spirit on its own. That's our teaching. And interestingly enough, Odaban, word for car, is also an animate noun. I get it. You know? But as to say, it's this recognition, you know, that we live in a world that is not, it is not just we who are alive. It is the world is alive, you know, and our relatives have standing, have right to be recognized. And in that, we are also taught of reciprocity. We are taught when we go out and harvest, whatever you harvest, don't take the last plant. That's what we're taught. Don't take the last one. You know, be respectful, always give thanks. They say that this is the Ojibwe New Year starts now. That's what we're saying. Our first harvest is our maple sap. It's our first medicine, our first harvest. But we have Thanksgiving all year round. I don't know about that one. Someone told me they call that thanks for taking, someone was saying, because the one in the fall. But in our case, we have those Thanksgiving feasts all year round, because we recognize the bounty which is that which is given to us by the Creator. So I say these things because I wanted to contrast them with where we're at. That's why I said it. In our teachings, all of this is tied together in this phrase, which is Minobamadaziwan, which means the good life. And what I would tell you is that in traditional Ojibwe teachings, we have what is a covenant, I would say, with the Creator, which is an agreement. That is, behave this way, you'll have a good life. Behave this way, and you'll have a good life. Behave in this respect to our relatives, in this understanding of the Creator's law. So, what I want to say is that America does not think the same way. And that is a little bit of, I think, how we got to where we are at. For instance, instead of believing that the Creator's law is the highest law, we live in a society which perceives that man's laws are the highest laws. How is that reflected? It will be reflected easily in things like allocating water rights and the over-allocation of water rights until there is no water left in a river. Or trading pollution credits. Very interesting construct. Or changing allowable levels of pollutants. Recommended daily allowances of pollutants, or whatever it is called. Or changing the figure that they use, or the parts per million, parts per billion, or whatever the terminology is, and so it becomes more mystifying for people to understand what it exactly is in their drinking water, except for that now we know that we all got lots of birth control pills in us from that city drinking water, don't we? You know, what is it? I mean, everything, right? Everything, or jet lighter fluid in our breast milk. Great, great. You know, and so we've been very clever. We passed our own laws, but in the end, I think you all know that you got to drink the water. And you have to breathe the air, no matter how smart we are. No matter how smart we are. Instead of believing that we are all related, we are entirely anthropocentric. We live in a world which thinks of humans and also views the rest of the world in terms of its utilitarian benefit to humans. That's how we plan. So we essentially make paupers of our relatives. Try being a buffalo up in Yellowstone National Park and crossing the border. You're going to be shot by the Montana Department of Livestock because they have over-allocated grazing rights in the areas adjoining the park to ranchers. And buffaloes roam. That's what they do. They roam. They actually don't know the difference between the national park and grazing land in Montana. You know, try being a salmon on the Columbia River, and you'll find that your head will run up against a dam. You know, our ability to reckon with our relatives is not respectful. That's why we've caused the extinction of more species in the past 150 years than since the Ice Age. That's the consequences of that kind of behavior, and the crash of one after the other is what we are looking at now as a consequence of global climate destabilization. Not just development of malls. At this point, we are talking about exponential crashing of all of these ecosystems. We do not view the world as animate. We view it, again, in terms of its utilitarian value. So I spend an inordinate amount of time arguing with loggers and counties in northern Minnesota, county foresters, over whether it is a forest or whether it is timber resources. or the extension of that is board feet. And it's the taking of something that in one point in the language is animate, a forest, and turning it into a utilitarian term, which is timber resources, or board feet. It removes us from responsibility and relationship in that process. Enemy combatant. You know, it is this frame of mind that removes you from relationship to place and removes you from relationship to living things. So right now I'm about to launch into a battle. Have to have a new battle every year. This one is over the maple stands of the White Earth Reservation, and if they are maple stands or if they are board feet. Because I'll tell you what, it takes 100 years to grow a maple stand, to produce sugar, maple syrup, and they aren't making any new maple stands. You know, it is board feet. I recognize that, but how do you replace the first harvest of a culture? How do you replace that medicine? You cannot replace it with genetically engineered sugar beets. It's not the same thing. It's a different thing entirely. So we do not, in this society, recognize the animate nature, and even food itself. I'll talk more about that later, but you know, traditionally most cultures have relationship to our relatives' food, and you turn something from corn into an agricultural product, it changes the inference of what it is, and it is no longer alive. It is dismembered from its history, from where it came from, and its oral tradition and its relationship to people. Because corn did not come to be as it is by itself. It came because of a hand, many hands over many generations. We do not have a cyclical world. We are the most linear society known. You know, that is the reality. We represent that in terms of social and economic practices. We have a society which takes natural resources and creates an immense amount of waste. That's what we do, which is an entirely linear production system. I was talking to some students earlier today at Haskell, and I just saw this great film called The Story of Stuff. Have any of you seen this film? Story of Stuff. I recommend it. You can, I think, order it off the internet or maybe even view it on the internet. About 20 minutes about how we created an entirely linear production system which makes products which basically 3 to 5 months later are in a landfill, you know. I mean, you know, one of my pet peeves, I'm sure you all, I'm not to say you have the same pet peeves as me, is why is not a single cell phone charger universal? You know? I mean, that's just like a small part of the problem. You know, but it's the creation of garbage. And it's the creation of an entire linear production system, you know, which is based on producing things that we pay for and then we throw away. You know? It's a linear way of thinking, which is a society which is based on empire. The idea that you always have a new place to conquer, always have a new place to throw your flag, or plant it, say it's yours. A new frontier. The West is a state of mind. That's what it is. It's a state of mind. And it turns out that there is no more frontier. You know, although they are shooting those guys off to space a few years ago. I can't remember, the guy's name was Gregory Olson, some millionaire, multi-millionaire. Do you remember this story? He decided to spend like $10 million to go to space, 30 million, maybe it was 30 million to get shot into space. Right? So, of course, I write op-eds for all the local papers in northern Minnesota, which are these conservative Lutheran towns. So my op-ed was, send them all there. I mean, what is that plan? You know, I'm going to go spend 30 million bucks to go to space. I'm like, why don't you guys all go out there and we'll manage your assets. Maybe we can build some levees, a few bridges, you know, clean up some coral reefs. I could, you know, if that's what you want to do with your money, go to space, orbit as long as you want. I could think of better things to do with your money, you know. But anyway, you know, what is that frontier? I mean, that's his whole way of thinking. You know, is that there's always going to be a new one. But what happens in that way of thinking is that there is no accountability to where we are. You know, because there's always greener pastures. So I'm going to move on. It's going to be better where I go. There will always, and it's a very American settler mentality. You know, at a certain point, you got to say, no, I'm staying right here. I'm going to make this a good place. This is going to be a beautiful place where I live, and I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to have a relationship which is reconciled with land and people who are here, and it's going to be over the long haul, you know. But that's this challenge, you know, because Americans think this way, and that has causes us a lot of problems. And how it is reflected Perhaps best, two of the biggest growth industries in this country, two of them. One, waste management, entirely linear. The example, building it, so 50 trillion pounds of garbage a year, that's what we do. Congratulations, Americans. 50 trillion pounds of garbage a year with no plan, Most of that doesn't have to be produced. But we build an industry based on waste, wasteful production systems in itself, and then make another industry based on dumping it, And I go these places, and it is awesome. It is just awesome how innovative they are and what to do with this waste. I was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in fall, and the entire ceremony, 50% of it was underwritten by a waste management company. I kept saying, can you not say too much about that? Of course, I couldn't help it. I had to mention it. Going into Seneca Falls, that historic town, there's mountains of waste from Syracuse. Mountains. It's not even landfills, it's mountains. Southern Pennsylvania or northern Pennsylvania, they're backfilling mines with waste. I'm wondering about the long-term environmental impact of that one. Don't even get me started. But, it's these questions of what is that as a plan? And then the perfect example is the social production of waste. And the social production of waste is prisons. And that's what we do. We do it really well. Of the 9 million people in the world in prisons, 2.1 million are in the United States. We have more prisons than anybody else in the world. All those countries we point our fingers at, we have more people in prison. We have more people in prison. 2.1, and it's a huge growth industry. Towns argue and vie for the right to have a prison as a long-term economic plan. Warehousing human misery. And it used to be 1 out of 140, and I was reading it went to 1 out of 100 people in the United States in prison, and I'll tell you what, in my community, it is very high. Young men between 18 and 25, 18 and 30. I think in African American communities, it's 1 out of 9. Reservation, I'd say it's at least that. Young men, in our community, very terrible, this situation, I used to want to be a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer because of this, because I spent all my time getting my cousins out of prison for dumb things, So instead I'm looking at the root causes. What happened? How has this happened to us? But I say that, why would you want to build, an industry? That is the social production of waste. It's linear, and it is not sustainable. And the reciprocity, giving thanks, taking only what you need and leaving the rest, that is not America either, is it? America consumes a third of the world's resources, requires constant levels of intervention into other people's countries to consume those resources. We feel entitled to this level of consumption, and we have no need for this level of consumption. It's entirely wasteful, and it requires constant violations of other people's human rights and constant violations of a covenant with the natural world. And yet we aggrandize wealth. We glorify it. We pedestalize rich people as if they are interesting. And I'm really pretty clear that they are not. There might be a few out there, I know you're going to say, geez, that woman has some issues with class. But come on, what exactly has Paris Hilton done for the world? Give me an idea. I'm saying that's a perfect example, and someone will say, you're just picking on her, but it's a perfect example of the problem. What has she done of consequence, and why should she should any trees be consumed in discussion of her life? All right, you guys are going to think about this, I know, for the evening, and they're saying, I know she did something. I know she did something good once. All right, I'll leave it. But the point is that it is not an abstract discussion. The reality is that the disparity of wealth is destructive to human lives. The disparity of wealth on a worldwide scale, they're saying 224 people in the world, folks, this is the UN Development Program, have the same income as the bottom 2.5 billion people in the world, 225 folks, right? And these guys at the bottom are not doing well. They don't have food, they don't have sanitation, they're living in war-torn zones, in refugee camps. And the guys at the top, they got too much. I was really thankful, you will laugh a little bit, but I was really thankful Did you hear what the Pope said here a couple of weeks ago? Any of you follow the Pope? No, I was like really pleased with the Pope. I was at Winonas Own Reservation here a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago in South Dakota, and I heard this, that the Vatican issued a decree, I don't know what you call it anyway. They said that there's 5 new sins. Remember this? And someone said this to me, I said, this is a joke, right? Like, I was trying to figure out, like, what else I could do that was not right, 5 new sins. Did you hear this? This is not a joke. 5 new sins. I can't remember all of them. The first one is obscene wealth. They said obscene wealth was a sin. They moved from individual sins to collective, societal sins. Very good. I thought that was very good. Thumbs up. And another one was contributing to climate change. Yeah. And I can't remember the third one. Genetic engineering. Very interesting. I never actually thought I'd be on the same page as the Pope, but I'm there. And but anyway, having said that, so even the Pope, so you can say it wasn't just that radical woman, it was the Pope who said that obscene wealth was a problem, it was a sin, right? So I get off the hook, right? All right. So in the end, we're in this situation where you got to question if the paradigm is sustainable. That's what I'm saying. The argument that I'm making is that empire is not sustainable. One would do well to figure out how to live in accordance with natural law. If you want to live in a society which is based on reality, not based on our perception of reality, but is instead based on reality. Because the fact is, they are not making any new water. The water we have now is the same water as when the dinosaurs were here. Nothing new. Exactly the same water, And so that's what we got. That's to work on it. Now, I have to say that I was corrected, and someone did point out that they are making new water, but that is through the melting of the polar ice caps, which is not the way you want to make new water, right? That is the reality, And so we're using 300 gallons a day. We, North Americans, 1.7 billion people in the world are water challenged, about to go to 2.5 billion people. And we are using our 300 gallons a day, and a good chunk of that is going on our lawns, and a set of other practices which are totally unnecessary, our level of consumption of water. So that is the reality. Ulysses, Kansas, somebody told me that's over there where those power plants are that they're proposing. $190,000 just on some kind of water study. In Lubbock, Texas, $100 million for water in the next while. That's what they're looking at. Anybody who's over the Oglalas got a challenge, right? Not making new water, and you aren't going to fix it with the way it's going. So that is, in the end, where we end up with. You're either a part of this creation, and you have to at some point account for your practices, or you don't. And I'm thinking that we have to come up with a plan to be accountable. So, here we are, this new millennium, and we are challenged. But as I was saying to those young students at Haskell, we have the opportunity to do the right thing. That is the great thing about this, I was reading an interview with Alice Walker, and she said, I can save a mountain from having its top cut off for coal strip mining. I can save a river from being poisoned. I can take down a dam so some salmon can go where they're supposed to go. What an amazing thing to be at a time in the world where you can do something, to make a change, to make a difference. In my own community, I'll tell you a little story. About 8 years ago, my family and I went to cross the border to Canada. We as Ojibwe people, we have a lot of trouble with the border, because actually my children are considered resident aliens. They're from the north side. What are you going to do? Indigenous people, resident aliens in their own land. Isn't that a bizarre construct? I don't know. So the resident aliens and I went to Canada. We go to see our relatives up there on the other side of this little reserve called Rainy River Reserve. Manitou Rapids. And I go see this guy up there who I hear about. He's legendary. His name is Joe Hunter. I just think he's the awesome guy. Anyway, they have the largest sturgeon hatchery in North America, and one of the largest in the country, because they have in the world, sturgeon stock have collapsed in a lot of places, but these guys have sturgeon. And so what they do is they take the sturgeon out of the river, and they have sturgeon sex, and then they put them back in the river, right? So that they aren't a captive population of sturgeon. That's what they do. And so I went up there to see this wondrous sight, because on my reservation we had lost all of our sturgeon. They're all wiped out by dams and greed, you know, just wiped out. And we have a sturgeon clan on our reservation, and we have lost our relatives. It's very sad. So I became compelled to go see this sturgeon, and I went up there and I could pet them. It was just amazing, because they're so docile and huge and awesome. And I just was really smitten with him. You can tell that. Anyway, so then I said, Joe, can I have some sturgeon? And he said, yeah. And he said, come back. So I came back the next week. And I have to tell you, Joe Hunter is known as the Sturgeon General of Canada. Isn't that a great title? The Sturgeon General. So I said, Joe, can I take some sturgeon home? He says, yes, you can, you know, because we're the same watershed. You know, this is all biologically copacetic and everything. So we go up there the next week. I have 4 children with me and an Aerostar van, 2 Coleman coolers, and a bubbly thing that hooks up to my car lighter. And I go up there, cross that border, go into Canada, and go visit with the sturgeon people. And I go get 5 sturgeon. And I put them in my Coleman coolers, and I get ready, and I say, so what do I say when I hit customs, Joe? And he says, oh, just say they're your pets. So there we were with our 5 sturgeon going back across the border, right? My kids are practiced at crossing customs, you know. Like, head back down there across, we go to our reservation, and we put them back in our lake. And I tell my kids, I'm not big on cages. I said, that's your aquarium now. That lake, you know, put them in there. And then after that, I go talk to my tribal biologist, who this is often tribal and state and federal officials, when they see me, they go like this. He's like, Winona, do you know how many laws you just violated? That was his thing. It's like, you know, like that transport or transportation of endangered species. You know, he had this like long litany. I said, Randy, there's the Creator's law, and then there's the white man's law. I said, this is the Creator's law. Those sturgeon need to come home. I said, they just made those laws up. They have nothing to do with us as Ojibwe people, you know. And so it took a little processing in Randy's head, but it didn't take long. Because then, within the next year, my tribe developed the largest sturgeon restoration program of any tribe in our area. And now we put in like 25,000 a year, sturgeon in our lakes, and we have big ceremonies and feasts for them. Isn't that awesome? See how you can do that? You can bring back your relative into your own area. And then this last year, my first grandchild was born. And do you know what clan he was? Sturgeon. Isn't that awesome? I said, oh, that's why I did that, so your relatives could be here for you. So I just was really happy how that all turned out. But I tell you that because you got a shot at doing something, you know. Here we are. We have combusted ourselves to the edge of oblivion. I don't really know how else to put it, you know. We've burned everything we can. We've mined everything else. We've deforested, you know. Got ourselves to the point where we are. We raise the CO2 by, you know, a third. Melting the polar and Antarctic ice caps. I was just up in British Columbia. The bark beetles have consumed the entire forest. They're expecting to run out of fuel and food in 2 years. They're like, the good news is they're out of wood to eat. It's like incredible. And about 3 weeks ago, village of Kitterina in Alaska with Native American Rights Fund sued 24 oil companies because they're falling into the ocean. In Alaska, I believe that there are 184 villages that are falling into the ocean. GAO, General Accounting Office, predicts that that's going to cost between $100 and $400 million each to relocate them, and they're going to put those native people in Anchorage, probably. You know, that's what they're looking at, which is, to be honest, cultural genocide. to take the people who are a subsistence people and to move them into a city and say, go get a job at Walmart. That's what we're talking about. So they just, that's the reality. We have combusted ourselves. Got a 2 to 4 degree temperature range. They're saying a 34% reduction in the corn crop in North Dakota with the temperature increase that we're looking at. I'm not sure what the industrialized agriculture plan is for Kansas, but you better be thinking of one, because that is the reality of climate destabilization, is you do not have the ability to grow what you thought you could grow with all those gizmos you were growing up with. We have reached our peak oil, or sometime around there. That is to say that I had to break it to my 17-year-old son that before he could even drive, I had consumed half the world's known oil supplies. He's still mad. He had anticipated that exciting life on the road in some Mustang or Camaro. That's not happening. I said, sorry, buddy. Consumed half the world's known oil supplies. What's left is at the bottom of the crack in the sea in China, up in the 20,000 feet under the polar ice caps, or there's that stuff in the tar sands in Alberta. Going to mine an area the size of Lake Superior, use a bunch of nuclear power plants, contaminate the water, and just to squeeze it into the gas tanks of our SUVs, pretty much. That's the plan that Canada has, Incredible. And then there are the countries that have oil. But it turns out you can only invade so many countries. At a certain point, $104 billion a year war, we will run out of the ability to invade any more countries for oil. That's the reality. And those countries are not going to all turn over and give us their oil. That's the reality. So we have the intersection of those two issues, and then those issues intersect directly with food security. Most of your food that's grown out here, thanks to the Green Revolution, we've reached the saturation point. That's what they call it, scientists, which is doing pretty good for 10,000 years in agriculture, pretty much using green manure, local food, local labor, sustainable cyclical system of food production that involved a cyclical energy system. First expansion of food production was largely taking of the plains from the indigenous peoples, turning it over, taking 50 million buffalo and turning it over to 28 or 30 million cattle. There you go, new food production system, but turns out it wasn't sustainable, because then you got into the Green Revolution era, which massive increase in food production, but entirely dependent on fossil fuels. And that is what the problem is with peak oil. So they are saying that today, a couple of things, we use between 10 and 15 calories of fossil fuels to produce 1 calorie of food. Energy. Interesting, right? That is not a sustainable plan. That is between what you use, and then they're saying that 10% of that which you use, you have to use to mitigate all the problems we already made. My friends with West Jackson over here, a lot of you know West Jackson, the idea of how much more of a dead zone we're ready for, the bottom of the Mississippi, or on a worldwide scale, the runoff because we have an unsustainable agriculture system. So there's all your fossil fuels headed that way. And then there is the problem of transportation, which would be that the vast majority of food we eat doesn't come from anywhere near where we live. 1,546 miles, average distance from farmer to plate of food in this country. 1,546 miles, which is a heck of a long way after you've consumed half the world's known oil resources. Whether it is the salad tongs from Walmart or the shrimp from China, at a certain point, that's not a sustainable strategy, That food security issue is coupled with the issue of who controls the food. We are in a pitched battle in Minnesota over who has the right to patent our seeds, who has the right to own them, who has the right to genetically engineer them. Two corporations, major corporation we've been fighting for years is Monsanto. 87% of all genetically engineered cropland of the country in the world is Monsanto's. They are deep in it, probably deep right here in Kansas. You know? And the question is, do seeds belong to farmers and communities, or do they belong to corporations? I think 1987 was when the patent law was changed in the United States to allow for the ownership of life forms by private interests. An interesting change in law. Not only are corporations considered natural persons under the law, but now corporations can own life forms. So 1/5 of the human DNA sequence is patented. Interesting moral question, which I think is what the Pope was talking about. Let alone, 75% of the corn crop, 67% of the soybean crop, patented, genetically engineered. Owning of life forms. Huge ethical question for this society, a huge ethical question. So we are now in a situation where we better come up with another plan. And that plan has to be based on where you live. There is a master plan, but that master plan actually has to do with where you live. So I always tell the story of my own reservation. I have the privilege of working in my own community up there by Fargo and Bemidji, and then I have the privilege of working nationally in Indigenous communities around the country and elsewhere on these issues. I work mostly on land, culture, and environment, but it's focused on these issues of food security and energy, because I'm interested in the question of where we as Anishinaabe people are going to be 100 years from now, and how it is we're going to be in the same place that our ancestors lived for 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years. How it is we're going to hang out there, And that actually requires more than voting. That requires more than, hiring some consultants. It requires putting your heart and your prayers and your minds and your hard work towards it. And it requires getting out of your office, which is incredibly uncomfortable for all of us who are so highly educated that we now live in a society where people wait on us. We don't grow our food. We don't make any of our energy. We flip a switch. We don't build any of our housing. We just want to buy it, right? That's where we got to. We're all so smart. It requires actually engaging. It's like life is not a spectator sport, although you can watch it on reality TV, apparently. So in our community, this is what we do. I direct this organization that's been buying back land. We buy back farmland. I largely focus on farmland which has some isolation from genetically engineered crops, because it's a hard battle to grow a 500 or 1,000-year-old corn variety up next to a field owned by Monsanto. A lot of farmers will tell you that, because Monsanto will sue you. Once their pollen gets into their Roundup-ready pollen gets into your cornfield, they will sue you and they will win. That's what they've done. So we try to avoid them. And then we work basically on these issues of food and energy. And in terms of food, we launched into this by our campaign to protect our wild rice from genetic engineering and patenting, which emerged from our community. And what I will tell you is that our people have always riced, and we rice the same way now as we did 1,000 years ago. And that moon, Menominake Jesus, we go out in our canoes. 2 sticks, Bawa Iganuk, that's what my stick looks like. It's about that long, it's cedar. And my son pushes me through the rice beds, and I knock rice into my canoe, put out my tobacco, give my prayers, and I go across those lakes on my reservation. We reserved that land. That's what reservation means, reserved that land, because it had the best rice beds in Minnesota. Big Rice Lake. All those beds. So we rice, and we start to the south, because rice ripens earlier in the south, not surprisingly. So I go off reservation to rice. I rice in the Crow Wings, and then I keep heading north. And I rice, and I get that food for our family. So we usually go on the Crow Wings, then we end up on the Ottertail, and then we end up on Rice Lake. 3-4 days ricing. That's what we do. And that is living in according to the Creator's law, because that's where the rice is. We figured that out. Go where the rice is. That's how you can know what to do. And then we bring it in and we put it in gunny sacks, and then we parch it over fire for about 2.5 hours, and then we put it out, and then we dance on it with our new moccasins, kind of like the grape thing, to take the hulls off. But if you got 50,000 pounds, you might want to run it through a little machine. And then you winnow it with a new Scotch and Og in a basket, or else you can winnow it in a fanning mill. That's what you do. And that's how you make your rice. And we only rice in the morning. We quit in the afternoon because the rice is only supposed to be harvested in the morning. It lets it ripen in the afternoon then. And then the next day it's ready again in the morning. That's how it works. And then we always have a big feast. We have a big powwow, Thanksgiving, and we just celebrate our rice. So that's how it went for a long time. It sustained us, major source of food for our community and a major source of trade for our community. And then what happened to us is what happens to a lot of people. Some anthropologists came to see us. And those anthropologists, first they came out and measured all our heads and scratched our skin and measured us across our noses to see who was the most Indian of all Indians. This is a kind of a bad era in anthropology, the physical anthropology era. Actually, this guy's name was Herlishka. He was responsible for a lot of this, but his idea was he had this idea about cranial capacity being equated with intelligence. And he believed that people of European descent were just a lot smarter because they had bigger heads. So he spent an inordinate amount of time measuring heads in native communities. And he said that we were kindly. That was his report on us. He didn't say how smart we were. He said we were kindly, though, which I thought was kind of a nice reference. But I have to say that the era ended badly for him because Mr. Herlishka ended up, I guess, over in Mongolia and measured some heads in this one village and found out that everybody there had a bigger head than anybody in Europe. So I was like, oh, that white superiority thing isn't panning out so well. Anyway, but I just want to mention that because it's the reality. And the other thing is that you can actually learn a lot more about a person by talking to them than measuring their head, which is a much better plan. Anyway, so he came out and he brought this guy Jinx with him, and then he didn't come out the next time. He was too busy going over to Mongolia getting depressed. When he came over and saw us, this Jinx guy, and this guy watched us rice, and he became very upset watching us rice, because then we riced and then we danced and sang, and he became obsessed. And he basically he said, how could so princely a grain be given to so savage a people? Was his thing. How could people... he called it an Ojibwe Mardi Gras. He said basically we were dancing too much and singing too much and we weren't working hard enough and we would never become civilized. And I say that to you because that is kind of, I think, one of the, I don't know how to say it, but that's one of the things about industrialized agriculture. It's like at one intersection is it no longer culture? At one intersection are we no longer related to celebrating our food and our harvest and enjoying the greatness of the gift that is given to us. It's not just Ojibwe. It's just at some point, someone, says, we're going to have a factory farm, and that's a different relationship. And so he came out, he was very upset with us. We kind of blew him off. We continued doing what we do. And the University of Minnesota became obsessed with the idea of creating domesticated varieties of wild rice. They spent about 40 years domesticating wild rice so they could grow it in diked rice paddies in northern Minnesota and use chemicals and fertilizers and drain the paddy and harvest it with a combine. And they called it progress. I'll tell you what, it doesn't taste like a lake. It tastes like a paddy. We don't think they should be able to call it wild rice. We think they should have to call it tame rice. It's a different thing. But anyway, that had a huge effect on our community, because we sold that rice to keep, that's how my parents met. We sold that rice to put clothes on our kids' backs and fix our furnaces and fix our Indian cars and all that. Get ready for winter. We sold that rice. And 2 Indians in a canoe cannot compete with a guy with a combine. That's what happened. So those guys started fixing the price of rice, trying to force the price of rice down at Lakeside. And our community started fighting them. So in 1984, 3, Margaret Smith and I, she's my cousin, she's 90 years old. We went down to Lakeside. Margaret's tough. We just say tough. And these white rice buyers were trying to force down the price of rice at Lakeside and telling Indian people that they buy rice for 50 cents a pound, green, instead of $1 a pound. Trying to force it down there, saying that, when they control, they owe the money. And so our Indian people were saying that's not, we're mad. And so Margaret and I, we had some money from the Catholic Church. Very thankful to the Catholics, funded us for many years. The Catholic Campaign for Human Development. And they came down, and they didn't know how much money we had because Margaret's a really good bluffer. So we had a few $1,000. Margaret had it stuffed in her bra and stuff, like old ladies do. I'm be just like that when I'm old too. And then went there and went down to Lakeside, and we started buying rice. And those white rice buyers are over there, and they're looking at those 2 Indian ladies buying rice, and we're paying $1 a pound. And that's how we started forcing the price up. Because the rice, you could only buy it a short window. And so they all had to buy it for $1 a pound, and we started battling them like that. And we kept it up, and kept fighting them, and, then in 1986, 2 of our guys sued Anheuser-Busch. Because Anheuser-Busch, the beer corporation, had some wild rice called Onamia wild rice with 2 Indians in a canoe on the side of it. And it came from not even Minnesota, it came from a diked rice paddy in Northern California, which is where 75% of all wild rice now comes from. And we said that was misrepresentative advertising. And so our guys, Frank Bebo and Mike Swan, sued them in Minnesota court and won. And in the agreement, they have to now label all the rice in Minnesota as paddy grown if it comes from a paddy, anything that's sold in the state of Minnesota, right? The problem is the loophole, which is in Kansas, it doesn't have to be labeled. We want a national labeling law because we think that 2 Indians in a canoe should get credit. And they shouldn't be able to sell their rice for the same price as we do. It's kind of like the fair trade issue in coffee, So that's how we started this issue. And then in 2000, 15 years later or so, the University of Minnesota announces it cracked the DNA sequence for wild rice. And that was where we finally got zipped, And I am basically, I'm a rural development economist by training, and most of my work is in energy, but our elders asked me to intervene in this issue, our organization, so we went down there to the U. And I know this is, these universities and the dean of the college, heavily invested with biotechnology, very similar to this institution. They said the perception was that this was academic freedom. The right to genetically engineer wild rice and to question that right would be a violation of academic freedom. And our position is that there should be some balance between academic freedom and academic responsibility. Because the reality is if you genetically engineer anything, but particularly a grass, plants have sex and pollen drifts. And they did all these studies and models, and I looked at those studies, and they said 1% chance within 3 miles. We said that's too high, but they had all this modeling of wind. I said to the guys that did the study, I said, so what about the ducks? Who's in charge of the ducks? It's like you could have so many scientific models, but you let me know if you took everything into account and how safe we're supposed to feel. And I don't know if you get this, but there's 20,000 acres it's not genetically, we have 20,000 acres of cultivated wild rice in Minnesota, and it is right next to 60,000 acres of lake rice. And so there is no buffer. There's no buffer. And there's no way to stop a duck. And so that's been our battle. And so far they have not yet genetically engineered wild rice. We've been battling them. This is 2008, 8 years of my life. Been battling. The university's right. Their perception is they should still have the right. In 3 years, we went to the Minnesota legislature. 2 years at the Minnesota legislature, I testified, and I just want to let you know what it is like. A lot of people here maybe don't appreciate what it is like being a Native person at a state legislature. And I just want to clarify this for you. I am pretty highly educated. Spent a lot of money and a lot of time in school, right? But a Native person goes to a state legislature, and we are viewed as being emotional, cultural, spiritual, marginalized. Our testimony is not considered with the same validity as a white scientist is. That is the reality. So I go testify at the legislature, and I brought 3 white guy scientists with me. And that is how I testify, recognizing fully. I was asked to speak on behalf of my community on this issue. But at the same time, just hearing from a Native person about what is right is not enough. It's very interesting, the paradigm of politics, and who has valid knowledge, and what is a valid stakeholder, and how the biotech industry, which has been around for, 20 years, got to have the same stakeholding rights as Indigenous people who have been here since time immemorial. And our wild rice is a part of our migration story. Like, how did that all pan out? That everybody got to be a stakeholder. Interesting political discussion. And so we testify. I testify as to the cultural significance. I have someone testify as to the biological impact of genetic engineering. I have someone testify from the university as to university ethics, and that universities don't have to do all things they can do. Basically, that's the argument. And then I have someone testify as to the economic impact of genetic contamination, because the reality is that there are a number of countries, municipalities, stores, and businesses that will not accept genetically engineered products. And so, essentially, genetically engineering a gourmet product is probably not a good idea. That's what I kept trying to say. Gourmet product, genetic engineering. Gonna have trouble selling that one. So we testify. Anyone want to guess the first opposition witness out of the gate? Monsanto, exactly. 2 years in a row. Monsanto Corporation testified. Monsanto Corporation said if the Ojibwe are able to stop any genetic engineering in this arena, it will send a chilling message to the biotech industry. I said, this is wild rice. This is our rice. This isn't yours, this is ours. Second opposition witness out of the gate was the University of Minnesota, who said what Ms. LaDuke is proposing would thwart the university's ability to combat bioterrorism, which is a very interesting argument. It was in 2003 they made that argument. And the intent was to put a red flag up on bioterrorism. And our position was, we're just saying you can genetically engineer wild rice. We didn't say you couldn't continue your work on botulism and anthrax and bad things. Go ahead, do that work. That's important. But it's so interesting, the spin. We considered it to be unethical. But 2 years in a row, we did not get a bill. We got a bill in 2007 that was passed. The bill orders a moratorium. We wanted a moratorium. We didn't get a moratorium. The bill orders a full environmental impact statement on any proposed introduction of a genetically engineered wild rice test crop in the state of Minnesota. That's what we got. And we got a study. And the study of all threats to wild rice, whether it is lakeshore development or whatever. That's what we got. It hasn't protected our rice yet. But one of our concerns is that they are putting in some genetically engineered rice fields in Kansas. And, I don't know if you know the $150 million in losses to the white rice industry for the, what's it called, Ventria biopharmaceutical rice that occurred the last time. 19 tribes across the country are in the arena of any of these biotech fields. 19 tribes impacted, let alone communities, We are concerned about these issues. I know that this is a big biotech state. I know that Minnesota is. But ask the biotech industry, ask Monsanto about the long-term health studies on Roundup, on pollen drift from BT corn. Ask them about the long-term health studies of planting that right next to a community. I just saw it. I was in Hawaii. I just saw it. 20 feet from a house. There's no long-term health studies. No idea. No idea. And they're saying that this year, 90% of the sugar beet crop in North Dakota and Minnesota is going to be genetically engineered. Gerber is refusing to use it, because what are the implications of using a genetically engineered crop in baby food? You know, I'm just saying, I think there should be a little more thinking, you know, before we start such wide introduction. So that's where we cut our teeth on, you know, is this issue of food security. And we're fighting to keep our rice because we know that biodiversity is how you ensure that you can eat. Genetic engineering and industrial farming are about the creation of monocrops. And anything that the Irish potato famine should have taught us is that what you want is biodiversity, crop variation. Our rice is tall and short and fat and skinny. Some looks like a bottle brush and some looks all punked out. Comes in early, comes in late, but you know what? A wind blows through, you still got rice, because only some of it blew off. That's why we're fighting so darn hard. But this whole thing politicized me, you know, on these issues of food security. We moved on, started growing our own food varieties out on our reservation. And we grow out Bear Island Flint is the first one we started with. This year I'm growing out an Arikara Flint corn. And it turns out that those old, non-hybrid, pre-petrochemical food varieties are much better for you. A study that was done at the University of Minnesota, one serving of hominy corn yields 47% of the daily recommended value for fiber and 33% of the DRV for B vitamin, thiamine. Arikara squash has 13% of the DRV for fiber, 64% of the DRV for vitamin A, and half the calories and double the calcium and magnesium of the market equivalent. Potawatomi lima beans. So I was asking that young woman at dinner tonight. They are low in fat, while high in carbohydrates and protein. B vitamins are found in abundance, including thiamine, niacin, and B6. Potawatomi lima beans also provide 24 grams of fiber per serving and a full 100% of the DRV. Finally, they have 21 times the antioxidants found in market beans. Isn't that interesting? Those heritage seeds that are not genetically engineered and that are not hybrid. Because it turns out when we got all smart and created this industrialized agriculture system, they bred plants so that they would hang out in the field a long time, be harvested in a uniform manner, you know, have a certain flavor, a certain appearance, and travel 1,500 miles well. It turns out that they somehow bred out all the good stuff, you know. So why do I say that? Because those guys are the guys you want during climate change. Because guess what? Potawatomi lima beans were not raised in an era with any fossil fuels or irrigation. All of those heritage foods are the foods for a resilient climate change strategy. Those heritage varieties, and they are not patented by Monsanto. But they require relationship. They require you to grow them. Not just buy them, they require you to grow them to keep the seeds alive and vital. You know, so that's what we're growing out. And then we're working with these other communities. I was in Hawaii in January, testifying at the Hawaiian legislature because same thing there. University of Hawaii has genetically engineered taro, what they make poi out of. Traditional food, but what is saving those Hawaiians right now is that we're trying to get a hearing at the legislature. What is saving them is that taro is largely propagated through its root. It's not a grass. But the Hawaiians don't want it genetically engineered, and in this case, the reality is that it is their older relative. In their cosmogenealogy, it is their relative, and it is their main food. So across the world, people are fighting for this right to food security. And the perception is not to have a sack of grain or a sack of corn delivered to them in a food program or commodities. It is the right to grow their own food. And the right to ensure that that food is something that has some nutritional value and some relationship in it to who they are. Our communities are also working on this issue of climate change, and, you know, I'm not going to give you a long speech on that, but what I will tell you is that you guys are really windy. How about I just start with that? I don't know why you're talking about coal in Kansas. I have no idea whose brilliant idea is that, except for I got a few ideas on it. You know, I'm spending an inordinate amount of time dealing with North Dakota lignite right now. You know, why someone would want to combust something that's slightly above burning dirt, you let me know. You know, Basin Electric, single largest CO2 emitting utility in the country, hands down. And they want the right to combust more and put up more coal-fired power plants in North Dakota, and they blow directly over my reservation. So we went to our tribe, 3 years ago, got some money from DOE, hired some consultants, blew through all them. I don't know if anybody else has done that with their tribe. I hired 5 consultants. I ended up saying that one of my friends says I have the little red hen syndrome. I was like, okay, I'll do it myself. Took all their data, figured out a bunch of stuff, and we just figured out how to do an energy plan for our tribe. We looked at where all our power came from, how much we were using, and where we could get it. So we did. Took it for a tribal community, and I figured out, 8 megawatts of power. Figured out where everything came from. Then I went and presented to my tribal government. They went like this. Well, not quite anymore. They're a little bit more, they're pretty good. So I lived through 5 administrations, that's what I'm saying. On my 5th. Anyway, my tribal government, I present to them, I said, we should do this because of our Anishinaabe values, move to renewable energy, and they kind of looked at me a little bit. A lot of our people don't know all our traditions, too. But you know what? It's not that different than America, huh? Don't know why we do stuff sometimes. And then I was talking about climate change, and you know what happens with most politicians when you talk about climate change? Here in the Bob Dole Institute? They're thinking, that's not going to happen while I'm in office. That's what they're thinking. And I'm thinking we need to be talking about intergenerational responsibility. Past when you are in office. But that is the look that I get. You get when you talk to people about it sometimes. It's not happening right now. I'm just going to keep on combusting. So, let me figure out, I presented to them finally, I said, how about this? How about this? We spend 1/4 of our money on energy, and we don't have any dinosaurs. That was my presentation to my tribal government, and this light bulb went on. They're like, no kidding. We got 65% unemployment on my reservation. Technically the poorest county in the state of Minnesota, and we're spending 1/4 of our money on outsourcing our energy economy, not even to mention our food economy, which is probably about half our economy. I'm trying to finish that study right now. How much we outsource, so then you become a wage-dependent society. Working for some job, minimum wage, spending all your money driving to work. It's a very inefficient equation. And so I present this to my tribe, and they understood that. And so my tribal government, I look at them and I say, look, this is our story, this is how much we use and everything from the best of our estimations, and so let's just start taking it apart. So we start with home fuels, and we choose strategies. Our first strategy is to be efficient. We weatherize. The other thing we're doing is we're putting these solar heating panels on the south-facing walls of our elders' houses, on White Earth HUD houses. Put solar heating panels, you can reduce 20% your heating bill. There's no point in putting in new solar electric stuff if you are losing that, that much anyway. No point. So we do that. And you could do that on any house here pretty much. It looks like you don't have a lot of trees. Plenty of potential to put up some solar heating panels. South-facing walls, that's what we're doing. And it is an intermediate technology that is available for a local community. It does not require a bunch of guys coming in from, some big city to do it. You can do it locally. It's a green economy. And then I said wood. My tribal government rolled their eyes a little bit at that one. I said wood is a 4-letter word. I know that. We spend an inordinate amount of time changing our houses from wood to propane. That was a really bad idea because we don't have any dinosaurs. So how about we relocalize our economy and try to go for efficient wood? In our case, because then you would employ people using what you have right here. And the other thing about a wood pile, I don't know how you guys do in this, but I have a big wood pile. I don't need to go to the shrink. I have a wood pile. Just go out bad day at the office, go hit the wood pile. I feel great. I don't go to the shrink. I'm not one of, someone told me that 60 million Americans take some kind of mind-altering drug during the day and 90 million at night. We're sleeping, huh? We're entirely sedated. I don't know if we've arrived to be so sedated, It turns out if you go to your wood pile, you can sleep good. So wood, And then I'm looking at fuel for a car, and I was telling those students at Haskell earlier, I'm just about to take it out, but I have the first grease-powered Mercedes on my reservation. I have a 1983 Mercedes that I purchased from some hippies in Berkeley. Bless their souls, they fixed it for me, retrofitted it. Mercedes, it runs on biodiesel and it runs on grease. Got 2 tanks. And it turns out we have a lot of grease in this country. So I've done quite well. They save grease for me all over White Earth, nearby. Go to polos and rodeos and pick up grease. It's awesome. I'm known as the grease lady. Very entertaining. My children are very, what would I say? My children sometimes are bummed out hanging out with me and picking up grease. Like, Mom, do we have to? I'm like, yeah, you want to get home? Let's go get some grease. But, everybody looked at me and thought that was pretty dang funny. I'm about to get the second Mercedes now, and then I have an ice cream truck that runs on this too. It's only sell organic ice cream. That's a different issue, but anyway. And then now the school buses on White Earth want to go for this because they can't afford to do the darn route. So we're looking at that, But the reality is that that's not the solution everywhere, and you know that. I'm just telling you this, but you cannot fit the whole U.S. corn crop into your gas tank. I'll tell you that right now. It's not going to happen. The other thing that you probably know is that we can't all have SUVs, right? The other thing is that James Howard Kunstler, he says that we have a train system in this country which is the equivalent, that's basically would be an embarrassment to Bulgaria. Got the most inefficient transportation system in the world right here. Might as well just own up. For the amount of moving we do, it's entirely inefficient. So I'm saying we could try to pretend we could all grease power and ethanol power our cars, but get real. You gotta have a train system that works. That's what you gotta have. You gotta have a way to get around, and you gotta walk a little bit more than we do. But we do that, and then we're putting up wind. And my tribe's got a 20 kilowatt wind turbine. I'm putting up a 250 kilowatt. My tribal government's putting up a 750. I think it's actually a 900 kilowatt turbine. And then we're putting up a 2 megawatt turbine for another tribe that doesn't have any wind. But go figure, we are the windiest Indian reservation in Minnesota. Felt very lucky about that. But go figure this one, Indian reservations are the windiest place in the country. Figure out how that one happened. And so you just let me know what your plan for Homeland Security is. That'll be ours. Because we actually think that a national energy policy should include a pretty significant renewable plan. And I'd rather have some wind turbines than, the plans forwarded by the Bush and Cheney administration like nuclear power. If nuclear power is the answer to global climate destabilization, what was the question? Do we want more nuclear radiation, more proliferation of nuclear arms? More concentration of power in the hands of a few corporations? Your answer is nuclear power. And more nuclear waste with no plan of where to put it? That'd be your answer. If you want energy, how about conservation and wind? That's it. So what's it mean, on a worldwide scale? Well, it means that Indian tribes can produce up to half of present U.S. installed electrical consumption. That's what they say, half from us. But on a broader scale, United States energy economy, incredibly inefficient. It's based on consuming more. Corporations make more the more you consume. Not an efficient equation in the least. We don't reward efficiency. That's what we need to do. And we need to just clean up our inefficiencies. They're saying that the amount of energy wasted out of present U.S. fossil fuels plants that's wasted as heat going out the top or whatever. The amount of energy that's wasted in the present fossil fuel plants in the United States is the equivalent to the same amount of energy. It's 33%. They're saying it's the equivalent to the same amount of energy used by the world's second largest industrial economy. That would be Japan. And that's pretty darn inefficient, isn't it? To waste that much. Let alone have a production system that's so linear. that it's entirely inefficient. And the transportation system where you spend up to 17% of your energy on food because we didn't localize our food economy, right? So that is the long-term picture. It's relocalizing and being more efficient. Relocalizing and being more efficient and having some relationship to it and some responsibility, you know, for that which you eat, that how you heat, you know, where you live. Does it have broader implications? Lester Brown, he's a smart guy. World Watch Institute, he gives me a headache, he's so smart. I try reading all his books. I don't know if any of you are, just let me know. He's writing on studies on hedonic psychology. Reveal that higher incomes only improve life satisfaction up to a point. He's saying basically, you know, at a certain point, your level of consumption is not going to do much for you. Better figure out how to do the right thing. But he says basically you could spend $98 billion a year for the next 10 years and start cleaning up your coral reefs, fixing your erosion problems, you know, detoxifying some of your rivers, putting up a green energy economy, figuring out how to do the right thing. $98 billion a year for the next 10 years would make a big difference. And what's that mean? You know what it means. We spend $104 billion a year on the war. So check box 1, kill people. Check box 2, make life. You know, that's what I feel like. It's our choice. And indeed, in the end, you know, we're the richest and most powerful country in the world. Arguably the most dangerous as well. I didn't even make that argument. And if you noticed that argument, Time magazine in Europe surveyed readers of Time magazine in Europe. They were asked the question of which was the most dangerous country in the world. All the evil Axis countries were on there. North Korea, Iraq, you know what I'm saying? All these countries were on there. The United States was on there. Which country did they pick as the most dangerous country in the world? United States. Interesting, huh? That was Europe. It's kind of like quoting the Pope, right? Anyway, richest and most powerful country in the world, no absence of the ability to do the right thing. Question is, we can do it. You know, and my thinking is that I told you what we do in our community. Arguably, we're considered poorest community, poorest county in the state of Minnesota. People with the least political power. But we decided that we actually wanted to be in charge of our destiny and not trust that to someone someplace else, because we weren't really sure that they would take good care of it. And after all, in the end, you know, that's what it really is about, is self-determination. It's not about how much you earned. You know, in the end, it has to be about if you're going to be able to drink the water, breathe the air, and, you know, how you're going to have some ability to think of the future. A lot of people working on this. There's a set of scholars working on a legal agenda for the commons and laws for the commons. They're saying basically that as public policy, the purview of public policy is to think not just for now. They're saying commons should be passed on to future generations unimpaired, that we shall have equal access to the commons. It is our right. Government's responsibility is to serve as a trustee of the commons. Market, commercial, and private property shall not externalize damage or costs into the commons. That's some of their remarks. But what I want to say is that in the end, the Iroquois Constitution said that about 500 years ago. You know what they said? They said, in each deliberation, we should consider the impact upon the 7th generation from now. In each deliberation. Now that is sound thinking, you know, in my book. Miigwech mi'yu. I'd like to thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to take a few questions as you like, but thank you, Miigwech. Okay. I don't remember the how the questions worked thing. Ah, there you go. I doubt that. They're very considerate. Here's a young lady in the first, yeah. Not supposed to step out from behind the podium.
If you were to be in the White House, what would be your top 3 priorities?
The top 3? What's like the top 3? Well, you know, you'll laugh at this. Well, some of you will probably scorn me for this, but I'll tell you what. When I was running for office in 2000, at that time I think I were 8 children in my house. I'm like a magnet. You know, there's like all these kids in my house, and I decided, you know, kids grow. So I decided to go to this place called Savers. Do you have Savers down here? It's like a used clothing store. It's not like this fancier used clothing store here, although I did get a really nice jacket here one time. But it's a used clothing store. And it's, you know, big, and it's, you know, so I was going there getting jeans. Because I figured out a long time ago that you can get used jeans for kids. You know, I just figured this out. As a matter of fact, I noticed that as one of those catalogs, I can't remember what it was that I got in the mail, they had these jeans called destroyed boys jeans that were $90 that had torn knees in them. And I thought, wow, that is something else. I could do that, you know. Send me your jeans. I will tear them up for you, and then I will send them back to you, and you can pay me $90. Anyway, so I went to Savers, and I had this entire shopping cart full of jeans in size like 2 to 12, right? And I was really proud of myself. They were like $1 a pair, right? This was very good, this jean thing. I think you even had a couple pairs for me. So I'm rolling them down the aisle, and this woman stops me, and she says, "Aren't you running for vice president?" And I said, "Yes, and this is exactly how I would manage the federal budget." You know, I mean, I know how much a toilet seat costs. You know, were they approving them at 10 grand a toilet seat over there for those Halliburton contracts? I know how to watch a budget. You know, apparently some of these people do not know how to watch a budget. So, you know, you're looking at how you spend your money, first of all. I wouldn't spend the money on the war. You know, I'd be getting us out of the war. I would, instead of having a foreign policy based on a military policy, the United States is the largest exporter of weapons in the world. You know, that's what we do. And that it turns out that you don't make a lot of friends doing that. You know, and it turns out you create a lot of refugees, and you create a lot more human rights problems, and, you know, a lot of hungry people, because you can't eat fields that are full of war. You know, and so you have to have a foreign policy which is based on making peace, not on making war. You know, to start with. You can have a lot more friends like that. And then, you know, looking at these issues of how you allocate the budget instead, you know, it baffles me, the amount of money we don't spend on education. You know, I'm not exactly sure what that plan is, you know, the cutbacks continually in education in this country, and how by the time you're out of school here, you're so in debt. You know, that is not just. You shouldn't have $40,000, $50,000 worth of debt, $100,000 worth of debt coming out of school. You know, how are you supposed to, you know, and then you go and you work, you don't need the lecture because half of you are in school. You know, that is not a tenable way to value, you know, that which occurs, you know. You know, those are some of the issues, you know, that I look at. Is, you know, how you ensure that that there's some kind of a parity and that it's intergenerational. And then, of course, you know, I'd spend the money the way Lester Brown says. You know, I'd say, okay, Lester, where are we spending that money on coral reefs? You let me know. You know, where we spend it on here, because that's, you know, that's a long-term investment. You know, those kinds of issues. And then this amendment, we talked about it as a 7th generation amendment to the Constitution, but I was just at this amazing conference on law of the commons, and, you know, essentially these questions of how our law became so transformed are, you know, huge questions that we need to address in society, and the question of whether trees have standing, or life forms have standing, or if only humans have standing. You know, who defends ecosystems, and, you know, it's this longer-term question of the intergenerational responsibility of public policymakers, you know, to protect commons for the head. So, thank you for your question.
This actually wasn't so much a question as a comment. That, first off, I love everything you said. I think I want to marry you. That it seems to me that all of these things all come back to the issue of personal responsibility. And my all-time favorite quote is, responsibility is the ability to respond. And I just feel like too often people are thinking, well, everyone else does it, or they compare their own behavior in terms of what someone else is doing instead of just taking the seed themselves. Unlike what you're saying your tribe did, that you took that responsibility yourself. And, in terms of the legislatures that you talk to or whatever it is, it just seems that those all come back to the same thing. And I understand that genetically engineering stuff is a Pandora's box, that once it's open, it's open. But I sort of feel the same way about that as I do about people smoking or driving big SUVs or whatever it is. That, yes, we have individual rights, but your rights stop where it starts imposing on someone else. And if someone wants to smoke a cigarette themselves, that's fine. I don't have a problem with it if they do it in their house with their windows closed and their air being recycled and filtered in their house, where that smoke doesn't get out to me or everyone else. And it's the same thing with the genetic engineering. If they want to have that technology and they want to put it in practice, that's fine if they do it in an eco bubble and it never goes outside of that wall and it's not open to the open air, which of course is never going to happen and you can't guarantee that anyway. But it all seems to come back to that same thing, that you have your individual responsibility, but when it starts affecting other people, that's where it's no longer your individual right.
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges that America faces is the question of community. Because people are taught to be very individualistic. And so it's drilled into people to look out for yourself instead of this, collective responsibility, which is a much higher level of maturity. That's the reality is that it's the difference between being like a 2-year-old and being an adult. And at this point we need to be adults and to think about that, and particularly the level of, implication. And then, I have to say that I don't have I have gray areas in some of this. I was talking to someone about genetic engineering, and there's like the inside versus outside question, which is what you're talking about. Like, I look at things like, genetically engineered medical, they're regrowing skin or something like that. Now that's a different league, than genetically engineered corn that contaminates an ecosystem. And so I don't have I don't have all of these things. Like there's a gray area for me in some of them. And, some people probably have some other analysis on this, but, in terms of something like, genetically engineered insulin or something like that, you look at that, and for me, that's why I'm interested in what the root cause is. We eat badly. We don't get any exercise. We put ourselves in this situation, and now we believe that the answer is that technology will save us. My perception is that you go back to the original and you do the things the right way, and you probably aren't going to need all that genetically engineered, stuff cobbled onto your body or whatever, and so, that's a little bit of my thinking on it. But and that in itself is a responsibility issue. People want someone to save them, which I think is entirely irresponsible. Instead of saying, I'm taking responsibility, I'm going to do the right thing because this is what the Creator gave me. And I'm going to do the best I can on it.
We have time for one more question, if you have one in the front row.
How do you relate to the problem of overpopulation this causes a lot of this, the green revolution, the pesticides, to make food for more people?
Well, in theory, we could say that the green revolution, the pesticides are to make food for more people, but we have more food produced in the world today and we have more hungry people. The reality is that the food is not, that's not actually true. A lot of the food is produced for profit. A lot of it is produced, in a set of conditions, and a lot of it is produced for us who overconsume, right? It's a tricky question. The reality is that on, one hand, I could make the argument that the problem of resource consumption, is that everybody in America consumes more than our share, and that the vast majority of the world doesn't even have a shot at having a decent life. And I'm not talking about owning a car. I'm talking about having enough food and some kind of security because of what the choices we make in this society and how much we make off of the weapons industry or whatever it is that causes the destabilization. The other thing is that people, questions about how many children are in a family. I'm a firm believer in a family's right and a woman's right to choose, to choice, which kind of puts me in the counter of the Pope on this one. But, I feel like, it's your right to decide how many children. And traditionally in our own societies, we have traditional ways of practicing family planning, in Indigenous societies. And, so this whole discussion, we do need to look at how many people there are, we definitely need to look at how many Americans there are, which, if I say something like that, that's like so politically charged. But it's true, because our levels of consumption are so high, and so there's not an easy answer, and we are in a tough spot. We are in a very tough spot. But anytime someone says, like I was reading this latest issue, if anyone has not seen it, of Yes magazine, it's a great magazine. You can just order it online from them. They're giving away the copies. It's on climate change, and they're talking about how Americans say, well, we can't do anything anyway because look at China. And then they're saying, well, look at China, as a matter of fact. They're investing like 10 times as much in renewables as we are in the United States. And everything, a lot of the things, they're making some bad choices, but they are leaping over a lot of the last millennium's bad choices in this country, making good choices in a lot of these countries, which is, what is essential. So, and I just feel like us guys, we have the ability to make good choices, and an institution like this, I don't know what your power bill is, but it should be on wind, that would be my suggestion. And your food was a great meal. I don't know how much of it was local. You have no reason not to have an entirely local food economy for an institution like this. You could totally revitalize so we don't have to worry about how much meat's going to get recalled from California. If you relocalize those things here. So anyway, Miigwech, thank you again very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.